Welcome to What's Up Wednesday. My name is Craig Mackay, your host. Our show today is about cybersecurity and how to plan for proper protection against cyber threats. Thanks for being here. Hope you have your lunch or a coffee or a cup of tea with you for today's show. You don't want to miss a beat. Our guest is a cybersecurity strategy advisor, and he has a wealth of information for us today. Of course, if you did miss something, the show is being recorded and will be made available on our YouTube channel. Just search for What's Up Wednesday on YouTube to find it. We usually have it up within 7 days, and we'll send out a notice to all attendees when it is available, along with a PDF copy of the presentation deck. What's Up Wednesday, the digital series, is brought to you by the Institute of Certified Management Consultants of Ontario in cooperation with CMC Canada. We've made a commitment to be here every month on the second Wednesday of the month. So please save a spot for us in your calendar. Next month, December 14th, exploring Canada's entrepreneurship ecosystem with Kayla Isabel from Startup Canada. Kayla has dedicated her career to supporting entrepreneurs and is passionate about leveraging the power of storytelling in the business community, particularly for women entrepreneurs. She's the host of the Startup Women podcast. She is a recent 40 Under 40 award winner presented by the Ottawa Board of Trade to recognize business leaders for their innovation, dedication, and community involvement toward Canada's post-pandemic economic recovery. So join us next month, December 14th. We are preparing a set of shows and guest speakers for next year, 2023. Save the Wednesday dates of January 11, Feb 8, March 8, and April 12. If you have suggestions for topics or guest speakers, put them in the follow-up survey that we send out after each show. We want to hear from you. Yeah, we actually want to hear from you. And next week, do some networking. Join our fellow CMC members for Converge, emanating out of the GTA Greater Toronto Area. November 15th, Converge is at 5 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, a unique virtual networking opportunity with a featured speaker, Kevin Gangle, CEO of Unstoppable Conversations. He'll be talking about the death of change management or transformation. Tune in, register at cmc-ontario.ca under Learning and Events. If you're a guest today, welcome. Glad you could make it. Consider a full-time membership. Our members are proven professionals who work on amazing projects and are willing to share their experiences. Reach out to colleagues in your consulting area and increase your network. Also, consider giving back to your community. Check out our Pro Bono program. You can help provide benefits to your community that might otherwise not be available. It's another way to earn CPD points. Most importantly, reaching out in your community and helping out can be rewarding for everyone involved in so many ways. You'll boost your reputation and create goodwill. For more information, you can email probono@cmc-ontario.ca. All right, now, how to participate in today's presentation. Please remain on mute and send your questions in via the chat. I will monitor the chat and may pose your questions during the presentation or at the end in the QA portion of the show in about 35 minutes from now. As you know, this Friday is Remembrance Day. So please take a moment to remember those who serve to protect our rights and freedoms. Remember those who fought or have provided support services for Canadian soldiers in World War I, World War II, Korea, or even more recently in Afghanistan. Also, yesterday, by the way, was November 8th, was Indigenous Veterans Day. The military service of First Nations, Inuit, and Métis in Canada has deep roots. Remember their sacrifices as well. Support the Canadian Legion, buy a poppy, attend a local ceremony, watch the national ceremony, observe 2 minutes of silence on Friday, November 11th at the 11th hour. Today, we're going to save the world in another way, all right? Protect yourself and your clients from cyber crime. Our guest today is Marcus Troiano. He is a renowned cybersecurity strategy advisor. He is the practice lead for Mandiant's strategic consulting services in Eastern Canada. However, he's actually in Portugal today. Marcus has led and delivered cybersecurity strategy development and transformation projects in Canada, the US, Latin America, Europe, and Asia. Prior to joining Mandiant, which is now a Google company, Marcus spent 4 years with KPMG and their risk consulting advisory practice. He was directly involved in client engagements in the areas of enterprise risk management, business transformation, operations improvement, cybersecurity, and strategy for financial services, government, healthcare, and energy sectors. Marcus also gained valuable industry experience through co-op placements with the Royal Bank of Canada, Sun Life, Exxon Mobil, CIBC, and yes, he has a Bachelor of Commerce from the Business Technology Management, Ryerson University, specializing in telecommunications and networking in 2010. Marcus will help us put the focus on providing innovative solutions to complex security challenges for our clients and our companies and what they are facing today. So it's with great pleasure that I welcome Marcus Troiano to What's Up Wednesday. Great to see you again.
Thank you so much. Appreciate the invite and very excited to be here today and to share some insights. And like we said, we'll keep it collaborative. If there's questions, please add them to the chat. Craig, I know you have a bunch of questions as well, just ready to go. So excited to share some insights and keep this, very informative and collaborative. And we'll be sharing this deck later on as well. If there's any questions that we can't answer right now, I'll take them away and hopefully provide some valuable insights for you and your clients on a very near and dear topic and very, of course, increasingly important topic for, I would argue, all of your clients. So excited to share some of my my learnings over the last 8 years here at Mandiant of the breaches we've helped our customers with and all the different projects we've helped them with as well. So excited to get going and thanks for the opportunity.
Yeah, no, I'm looking forward to it. Lots to cover.
Excellent. Okay. Just before we get started, we're going to have a series of polls throughout the presentation to keep it more informative. But I wanted to kind of ask around here, how many of you have been actively involved in helping your customers with cybersecurity matters? Whether, let's say, it's managing cyber risk, it's helping with transformations, whatever it might be. Just curious if you can indicate whether you have been actively involved or in your day-to-day or you have not. We'll have the results up there. So it seems like almost just less than half have been involved. I would probably argue that as we kind of work through the next months and years, I think this probably will continue to change, and we'll have more folks that will have active involvement, either whether it's from advising the board, advising your organizations, almost every type of either transformation project or advisory project tends to increasingly have cyber components. So anyway, just wanted to kind of ask before we get started to understand a bit more about the audience. So let's dive into presentation. So threat landscape right now, what we're seeing globally and in Canada. I'm going to go through some stats and also some stories and case studies. I'm not going to read all of these right here, but as all of you are aware, almost a daily occurrence, we have some major breach, major compromise of customer data, pretty much across industries and across countries. So many Canadian organizations, global organizations, et cetera, are targeted. Typically, if we think about the last few months, many major organizations that have millions and millions of dollars dedicated to cybersecurity have been compromised, have been in the news around either their customer data being stolen, a breach of their emails, a breach of their systems that are down, etc. So it's increasingly a very, very relevant area. And as you probably were aware as well, in the last 2 years, we've also seen an incredible rise in ransomware types attacks. And just over kind of the pandemic, with everyone moving to remote work, this was also kind of a catalyst. Of course, the benefits of having a remote workforce are great, and we've seen those come to light. And the digital transformation in how organizations are achieving that has been really good to see. But on the flip side, it has increased the attack surface of organizations. So organizations are increasingly open to attack from different avenues. So we'll go into that a bit more, but we do through the day-to-day work that I do and the clients we advise. Many of these headlines here and dozens of others are kind of what we do on a daily basis. So we take those learnings, and hopefully I'll be sharing some of those today as we walk through this. Okay. From an overall stats perspective, so my organization, we have a really good insight into what's happening just through the investigations we conduct. So we have a yearly report that kind of consolidates all of the stats, and I think it's several 100,000 hours of consulting time that we spend actually helping organizations recover and investigate breaches. And we've taken all this data, and I'd like to share some of this from a highlights perspective, just to see, what industries are being targeted the most and how attackers are getting in. You can see here that the number one most targeted industry, kind of tied for number one, is financial services, which makes sense. These organizations, these are banks, insurance companies, pension funds that have obviously a lot of customer data and a lot of funds that is very lucrative for attackers from a target perspective. So that's still number one. Also, business and professional services. These are consulting firms, these are law firms, these are other organizations that provide services to organizations, to many of your customers as third-party providers. The reasons that these organizations are targeted is because they typically have a lot of customer data, a lot of privileged information, and are a provider of services to many organizations that have a trusted relationship with organizations as well. So these are number one tied. You can see here healthcare and retail, also a lot of customer data, a lot of very important information. So these are also very targeted. And in terms of initial infection vector, so this is how the attacker first gets in when they target an organization. In the past, phishing has been, phishing still is the kind of the largest vector overall, but we have seen this kind of decrease over the years, and actually exploits, so unpatched vulnerabilities, exploits that are taking advantage in kind of firewalls, in external infrastructure, in email, etc., in cloud. This has increasingly been a focus of attackers. So again, the importance of making sure organization has robust patching and change management, increasingly important, and how they govern that, also very important. Supply chain, this has been in the news a lot as well. Supply chain, super critical in terms of how an organization manages their vendors and manages the data that their vendors have and manages kind of the systems that their vendors are providing them. There's been several very high profile compromises in the last 2 years that were service providers that were compromised, and as a result, their customers were then impacted either by kind of direct access to the environment or a data breach of their customer data. So increasingly important and relevant. And we'll talk about supply chain in a bit as well. Yes, please, Craig.
That supply chain one, just a question. We do a lot of interfaces with APIs between one service provider and another, and part of that sort of, whether you're getting credit card,
yes,
e-commerce, or even other data interfaces with third parties, is that really the vulnerable spot right there?
Absolutely. So I would say there's a few different supply chain. which has been increased, that are providing kind of software, either API management or different aspects of solutions that you're leveraging, either for your credit card payments, for analytics, of like data analytics, marketing information, whatever it might be. The reality is every organization is probably using hundreds, if not several hundred solutions from third parties. And all those third parties manage their code to different kind of specs. They manage their access differently, right? So understanding how those, like having a governance process around your use of those tools, first of all, the understanding of what tools you're using. And the reality is with a lot of code development, let's say for your clients, what actually happens is your code base is actually built on multiple different platforms, right? And you have multiple inputs into that, multiple APIs, multiple connections, and understanding kind of the bill of materials and all the different aspects there and how they integrate, and understanding the providers of those is increasingly important. So great question there, and great point. It is really around that, and it's also around, let's say, service providers that are processing your data, that are maybe providing maintenance for your systems as well. Those are also important.
Sorry, yeah, I just the supply chain one's really big, and I just wanted to kind of ask about that vulnerable spot on that.
And I would even say that supply chain, probably from a board perspective, and what boards are asking, supply chain risk and ransomware are two kind of the hottest topics that we're seeing right now. So it's always interesting to see that your customers might ask you, how do you advise managing our supply chain? What are the best practices we should leverage? What are the frameworks we should use? So we'll cover some of that later on as well. Just going to pivot here a little bit on Canada specifically. So it's kind of in line with global trends, but there's a little bit of difference here. We do have financial services is the most targeted as well. And due to a different makeup of kind of economy and whatnot, we do have kind of a large targeting of construction engineering providers. These are organizations that would have a lot of plans for, let's say, new mine development or new building globally, right? We have a lot of global consulting organizations that are providing engineering services in Canada that could be impacted. And then we do have kind of a mix throughout this of other organizations here. So pretty consistent. Typically, most of the nation, or most of the threat actors that we observe targeting Canadian companies have been kind of based either in China, in Russia, Eastern Europe, and North Korea. For the most part, typically financially motivated. Not as much nation state, but there is some nation state from an intelligence gathering perspective. There have been some high profile breaches of government. I would say maybe about 5-6 years ago, where federal government was actually impacted by nation states from a intellectual property as well as kind of espionage perspective. And this is really the new kind of, we think about the modern spy and the modern intelligence capability. Cyber is also how countries manage to keep kind of free-flowing information on their adversaries, right? So this is another impact, that's probably more impacting of government clients of yours. If you're advising government clients, they're dealing with a little bit of different motivation from the threat actors. But most of the clients you probably have are more impacted by financially motivated, either criminal gangs or countries like North Korea, has a financially motivated arm of their government that is basically set up to make money through ransomware operations.
Wow.
And actually, on a linked perspective here, if we look at kind of the current conflict in the Ukraine, Russia-Ukraine, there has been some impact and some kind of collateral damage caused through some of this. We hear on the headlines a lot of what's happening day to day on the ground there, and of course this is horrible. But what we also kind of don't necessarily hear day to day is that there is a cyber war also being conducted on a daily basis. We actually have teams that are working there right now, quite a few actually, on multiple ongoing breaches. So in the weeks and months before the invasion or the military operation in Russia, in the Ukraine, there were multiple different attacks that were launched against Ukrainian critical infrastructure organizations, power utilities, cell phone operators, internet operators, government agencies. I think about 15 to 20 different agencies were breached kind of day one. Russia is one of the most capable cyber actors out there. And they've been using a lot of destructive, what we call wiper malware. So not really, it's not ransomware, but it's basically the idea is to cripple the target organization by wiping all the systems. So it's in a way, it's more of a disruptive attack meant to cause damage. So there's been a lot of this happening. It's ongoing. Pretty much every time an agency has been able to recover, they're re-attacked. The reality is Ukrainian kind of cyber landscape is a little bit less mature than, let's say, Canada or North America. So the hygiene of the environments is not really up to where we're at right now. So there's been a lot there happening. And what we have seen, and what was an initial risk that the US actually highlighted, was that countries that are part of NATO and supporting sanctions against Russia could be caught in general kind of conflict. There could be, for example, targeting of the financial system of a country that is supporting sanctions against Russia. We haven't seen this happen. There was some initial concerns that this could happen. We have not, but of course, Russia is very capable of this if things were to escalate. There's been talk about potential to damage undersea cables for internet. The talk of, to launch attacks against financial sectors in other countries, et cetera. But we haven't seen this, luckily. But we have seen organizations that do have operations, let's say, in the region that have been impacted. There was a German satellite operator that was impacted. Perfect. Oh, I'm just seeing some comments here. Yes, give me 1 second. I'm just going to quickly pause and see if I can fix the lighting situation. When we started, it was fine, and I see right now it looks like I'm a hacker in a basement, and that's not the intention here. So give me 1 second. I'm just going to quickly see if I can fix the situation here.
The lights went off in Portugal. It got dark all of a sudden. Daylight savings time.
Yeah. Apologies.
So he's gonna light himself up a little bit more there. I think he feels awkward having lost some of that lighting in his hotel room in Portugal. Thanks, Kim. Maybe it was a little creepy. But what I find creepier and scarier is the cyber warfare going on here, leading up to the Russian invasion of the Ukraine. And how that might spill over into other companies. We can see that the concern for losing your creating disruption, losing data on your system, shutting down your system. Probably not that difficult really to do, especially if you don't have some very current protections in place and alternatives. So I was just saying, Marcus, that having alternatives to stopping and preventing takeover of your cloud programs or cloud systems or any data that you have or public information that you have on the internet. I mean, one thing you can do is be able to shut down one service and bring up another one right away, right? That's just one of those.
For sure. Yeah. It's
good preventive medicine approaches.
Yeah, it's highlighted the importance of increased resiliency. And actually, one of the trends that we saw in the years up to now, a lot of software companies actually have outsourced a lot of IT to Ukraine. And we had quite a few customers that were scrambling in the last minute to say, okay, how do we increase resiliency in case there is a impact on internet there, and obviously the situation is volatile, right? So we did have a lot of organizations scrambling to decrease reliance on Ukraine kind of IT, but there's still a lot of outsourced IT operations in the Ukraine, given kind of the skill set and the cost environment there, and one way that you can deal with that, like you mentioned, was that to kind of build out a kind of a hybrid cloud environment where some of those systems, instead of relying on kind of on-prem servers located in the region, you can rely on kind of global cloud providers that are kind of allow you for more resiliency. Okay. And actually on the cloud topic, this is of course another, if you talk about the top 3 or 4 topics that are most important to cloud globally, or to in terms of cyber globally, cloud is one of those. So we have seen an evolving landscape in terms of obviously increasing cloud adoption in the last 3 to 4 years. And there's a lot of great things that cloud provides. It does allow you to have a much more resilient environment, much more available, much more kind of globally accessible, etc. A lot of organizations are actually leveraging cloud to build parallel environments that they can kind of, let's say during a broad ransomware attack, they can actually recover to the cloud very quickly. So a lot of reliance on kind of BCP and DR, leveraging cloud environments. A lot of applications are, it's a lot easier to recover if you already have your apps in the cloud anyways. You just switch them over to your backup provider. So there's a lot of benefits here, but from a consideration perspective and risk perspective, there's a lot of risk too, because you are increasing your landscape and your attack surface. So we've seen a lot of, you can probably also kind of dig into headlines, but a lot of organizations misconfigure their cloud environments very easily. It's a service that's great to leverage, but you have to make sure that you architect and solution things properly, and you actually develop your security controls as you would on premise. So make sure that you do have, your proper configuration, your data is properly, you understand where your data is and is properly segmented and controlled. You protect your access. So access management is super critical in the cloud, because if someone takes over hijacks your access, they can delete everything. They can cause massive issues. Your insiders, your key administrators, making sure that you have enough monitoring around their activity. Insider threats, another big topic area. It depends on the region. It's a little bit less risk in Canada, but some regions that are a bit more susceptible to this is a big consideration. They don't want.
We put all our texts through security checks.
Every
for single one of them.
Especially if they have access, like administrative or key access, right? Typically, we'll see administrators, people in finance, et cetera, going through additional security screening, additional monitoring, right? This is very important. I was actually just in the Middle East last week on a project where, funny enough, this was in the Middle East. It's a bit different landscape. So cloud is actually very low adoption because many people are a little bit hesitant to move to cloud, just because, first of all, data residency, not being in the region, or not as much. Now in Canada, for example, most or all of the cloud providers have local data centers in Canada. Both Google, Microsoft, Amazon, they're all in Canada. This wasn't the case, maybe let's say 5 years ago. But in Middle East, there's still a lot of hesitancy to actually put a lot of their data in the cloud because of their perceived attack surface. So actually, Ian had a comment here around, would on-prem have less of an attack surface than cloud? And in some ways, yes, right? If you have a solid on-prem deployment and you manage that properly, absolutely, you can reduce risk. The problem is that if you actually look at your clients and you see how they manage their IT and how they manage their own data centers, in many cases, let's say a healthcare provider or a manufacturing company or another, let's say whatever the sector is, they're not experts at IT. And often we see them fall behind in terms of patches, in terms of server management, in terms of access management, right? So in theory, yes, you can architect a much more secure on-prem environment, but do the companies have a capability to manage that and maintain that? And is it scalable from a cost perspective and availability perspective? Not always. So this is where we see that cloud does offer a lot of benefit. There are obviously risks, but if you manage your governance, your access, and your configuration properly, you can actually have a more secure cloud model versus on-prem.
Yeah, the problem I found with the on-prem was the people weren't as aware, or it wasn't as necessary to do your upgrades for your patches, and you weren't as concerned. You thought, oh, the firewall's just for this portion here, right? And I can do that patch, next month, whatever. And the minute you go to cloud, all of a sudden, everything on that firewall and every patch and every upgrade is really important. And so even though the on-prem technically, as you say, is probably more secure in many ways, if you don't take care of it, it could be, there's a back door going right into your home,
sure.
right into your company's database, financial database. Boom.
And what's the case, like, I'm sure most of you have dealt with the IT organizations of your clients. There's very few organizations that I would say have properly managed their IT and footprint in the state. Just because, many organizations have grown through acquisitions. They have a lot of legacy systems, a lot of systems that aren't supported anymore. Very messy environments. They don't understand where their assets are, their most important assets, etc. So cloud does offer you to improve a lot of that. On the flip side, if you implement your bad practices in the cloud environment, you're replicating the same risks, right? So you have to think about it in a holistic way and actually fix things as you bring them to the cloud. And with that, actually, poll number 2, just kind of a question here around how many of your customers have actually migrated to the cloud. All, most, all, some, or none. And I would expect that in this case, probably all or most or some, given the Canadian landscape. But curious to see what people have been seeing. Again, this is very region specific. So here we go. Yeah, so majority or some of your customers have migrated, and almost no one here says that none of them have. And again, this was interesting. When I was in the other region, it was almost like probably the opposite. There was maybe 5% that had migrated and majority had not. And this is just kind of the maturity curve, right? I think the US was kind of the first one to jump on this. Canadian companies very quickly behind them. In Europe, there's still a bit of hesitancy, especially because a lot of these organizations are American companies and they concerned about data protection and legislation there. But most of the providers, again, have multiple hosting data centers within Europe as well. So that's changed. And actually, regarding privacy and the regulatory landscape, and regulation does drive, I would say, it drives some of the maturity that Canada has. So Canada is not the most mature in terms of cyber, but it's kind of right up there with the US. Regulation does drive, compliance requirements, which does drive, penalties for not complying and for not properly protecting your customers' data. There's been an evolving landscape here. It's one thing to note is that Canada is working on a federal countrywide approach. Right now, it's kind of a bit of a patchwork. There's different regulations in different provinces. Quebec actually has probably the most stringent data privacy and breach reporting laws in Canada. It kind of mirrors GDPR in Europe. We've seen that there was kind of a countrywide bill proposed. It kind of died with the last election last year. But it is being revived, and there's work being done to bring in some additional bills that will kind of raise things up. But I think the long-term approach is that the Canadian government wants to bring Canada in line with California and Europe in terms of GDPR, so that it's easier for companies to comply with multiple regions if it's kind of on the same level, right? Because those are more stringent than the current regulations. Okay, and wanted to kind of focus now on ransomware, a little bit of what we're seeing. I won't dive in too deep, because I'm sure majority of you have heard about ransomware and have seen kind of what it can do. But what we've seen kind of the trends being, it's been the last 3 years, probably 3 years ago or 4 years ago, in terms of the incidents we responded to, ransomware was a minority of cases in terms of our investigations. At this point, it's about almost 80% of our investigations are ransomware. So it is by far what we've seen kind of impacting organizations the most. And the reason for this is that, of course, there's a few different things here. One of them is that it's been very lucrative. And we'll talk about this a little bit more. And I think, Craig, you had some questions around this as well. But in terms of before the model of attackers to monetize, they would steal customer data, and try to monetize that. So they would steal customer information, they would sell that information online, make some money, but that's only one aspect. And a lot of organizations now, they understand they're going to be breached, and yet they'll deal with the consequences. But losing customer data is bad, but it's not the end of the world. What ransomware operators have been doing is they've been using a multifaceted extortion approach where they steal data, they hold that kind of ransom, and they ask for money, right? So they kind of blackmail you. They also encrypt your sensitive data or the entire environment, so you have an availability and disruption impact there too. They could bring down services that provide your customers with your platforms, and they also can publicly shame you. So we see either one, two, or all of these elements used. And what typically happens is an organization will receive a ransom note. It basically says we've stolen, a gigabyte of data that includes the following types of data: customer information, sensitive, executive emails, your code base, whatever it might be, important information. We have that information. We're going to release it if you don't pay us. Also, we've encrypted, 80% of your environment, and you can't actually use your systems. So if you want that information back, then you have to pay us as well. And what typically happens is they've actually now started going after the backup systems. So most organizations, through their BCP and DR programs, have a fairly resilient backup and recovery strategy. But what we've been finding is that attackers are smart, and they've actually been encrypting the backups that organizations rely on. And there has been a trend of less usage of offline backups and kind of off-premise tape storage in the last couple of years. But we're actually finding that organizations have to rely on that sometimes because the actual on-prem backups that are real-time are now being encrypted, right? So you basically have a model here that is very lucrative financially. And with the rise of cyber insurance in the last 3 or 4 years, and a lot of providers rushing to market and just providing coverage, and fairly easy to get that coverage, we've also seen insurers, at least in the beginning, facilitating payments to ransomware threat actors, because they actually see in many cases the ransoms are less than the cost to recover the environment. And this has been a financial payoff, right? A financial consideration that if it's going to take you 2 weeks to recover your, let's say, your mining facility, your mining systems, and you can't, mine, and you can't refine, let's say, your gold or whatever you're working on, then that's a financial calculation that may cost more than the $2 million that the ransom is asking for, right? So
are a lot of people actually paying these ransoms?
So it's interesting. We do track this, and there's actually some surveys out there, but we actually found, I think it was last year, that kind of initially less people were paying, but it became the ransoms actually increased in the last 2 years. I think the average ransom was, I think, about $1 million for larger breaches, and we actually found that almost half of organizations actually paid, and there's a few high-profile ones where they paid, not just $1 million or $2 million. They paid, one organization, paid 20. We saw 20 million. We saw 30 million. We saw more, right? So it depends on kind of the impact, right? We had the very, very public one, a breach about a year ago, where a pipeline operator had to shut down the pipeline from kind of a preventative security perspective because they had ransomware across the environment, and they were forced to pay, right? Because they're like, okay, we can either not provide half the country with fuel, or we can pay the ransom, right? Other organizations where they've lost access to critical systems, they've forced to pay as well, right? So it is really a business decision. We always advise, typically speaking, don't pay if you can avoid it. Really focus on your backups and your resiliency. If you can cut over to a clean backup and clean environment as soon as possible, this avoids the need to pay. But many organizations, the reality is backups aren't in good shape. They haven't been tested. They haven't been put through scrutiny. They're not properly secured, right? And in those cases, again, it's a financial decision. And if insurance is covering it, this is a consideration to think about. But we're seeing this change now. So we're seeing regulation in the US that you can be sanctioned as a company if the ransom threat actor you're paying the ransom to is on a sanctioned list. You can actually get in trouble by paying this. It's almost like paying a terrorist, right? So there are financial and legal sanctions that can be applied against you for paying. Also, one thing that happens is many organizations have no idea how to pay. So they don't have cryptocurrency available, of course. They don't have the savvy to do this, right? So they maybe struggle to do that, and there are providers that help you do that. But essentially, the one thing I would advise here is having a plan on how you would deal with ransomware. And if you were in a situation where you do lose access to your backups and you do lose critical information, you know, at least have a plan. Like, do we pay? Do we not pay? And how would we do this? I see a question here around when ransoms are paid, is data returned and not shared? So we've seen mixed things. We've seen instances where, you know, attackers take the payment and they still release the data, right? We've seen instances where maybe they don't release the data, but then 6 months later they get back in the environment and they ransom you again, right? So there isn't always honor among thieves, as they say, but for the most case, we actually do see that in majority of cases, data is deleted or returned and it's not released.
And they're not hit up again.
Yeah, I mean, it happens, right? It could be another threat actor, right? So maybe you paid one threat actor and another one gets access and they take you for ransom, right? So it's an important thing to think about for sure.
One of the things we do is we use a third party called Cloudflare, which protects our DDoS and prevents some intrusion.
Yes, yeah, absolutely. So web application firewalls, DDoS prevention mitigation, super important if you're providing services to your organization, to other organizations, to ensure greater resiliency there. So that's one tool that can help here too. But one thing that's really important is that you can see here some tracking we have around dwell time, which is the time it takes an organization to detect an attacker in the environment. The average globally for financial services, but overall, I think it's about 20 days, which means it takes organizations about 20 days to detect that they've been breached. For ransomware, they detect this much sooner because typically speaking, you're having dozens of systems that go offline. So it's a bit faster to detect this. But the reality is, even 5 days, you can have half the environment encrypted. So being able to improve security detection is one of the most important things to being more resilient, because then you can respond and contain and mitigate that much faster. Poll number 3. Have you been exposed to ransomware at any of your clients? Have any of your clients been kind of affected by ransomware, and have you had to help in some aspect? Okay, so for the most part, it seems like not directly, but I would imagine that you know, many of our organizations will be targeted at some time. So
I'll bet if we ask how many people have had their credit cards hacked, it'd be 100%.
Well, yeah, exactly. So yeah. It's still the biggest trend, and it's a growing trend. Okay. Yes, and question there around ransomware negotiation services. We always do, so even if you're not going to pay the ransom, we do typically recommend some level of communication with the threat actor. There are firms, several firms out there, Coveware, Cypher, etc., other consulting firms that will negotiate for you, and they can help you to determine whether, first of all, this is actually a real threat. Sometimes the attacker has nothing and they're bluffing, and they might not have stolen anything. They might not even have access to your environment, but they say they do. Maybe one of your providers was hacked and they have that data, right? I can provide those links for those firms, but two of the biggest ones are Coveware and Cypher. But we can provide links for those as well. A few more kind of key considerations for ransomware being more resilient. You know, just ensuring that you can increase detection, right? Delayed detection means a much worse situation. Improve your harden your environment, managing your access more effectively, super important. Having those response plans in place and tested, and then having a proper mitigation and kind of recovery plan, super important. Next slide. and a few other recommendations here. And we'll share all this information as well as we go through here. But again, making sure you have those plans, making sure you have the awareness. The board doesn't get super involved at all levels, but they should have an oversight role, and like they might have oversight role, especially if there's payment, because there's the financial impacts there. So understanding that, making sure they're aware of your plans to deal with ransomware, making sure your executives are kind of prepped on that as well, and they're aware of kind of the plans you have in place, and making sure from a system perspective you have the right level of backups, playbooks, and an overall strategy to deal with mitigating and recovering. Poll 4. Do you feel like your customers are prepared to respond to ransomware if they were impacted?
Nope.
And it's tricky. It's very tricky, because all it takes is one employee to click on a link, and you could be in bad shape, right? And there's a constantly evolving landscape of ransomware threat actors out there. So it is hard to keep ahead of it. But again, making sure, kind of taking an approach where you're going to get impacted, but making sure you can recover as soon as possible. So not prepared, somewhat prepared, right? So this is definitely a big challenge. And it should be one of the top things that organizations are worried about.
I'm glad to see a few people are prepared here.
yeah, there's some people prepared. There's a comment here around whether there's recommendations on managed security service providers. We can talk about it in a few minutes as well, but absolutely. As with IT, many organizations, many of your customers are probably not experts at security either. And unless they're a bank or a large organization, they probably should be looking at a hybrid approach where they do outsource some of the more difficult aspects of security. So having detection and response partially outsourced would make sense for many organizations, because you'll have experts that can provide that 24/7 coverage and give you that comfort that you can increase detection at least. So we can talk about that in a bit more as well. Pivoting a little bit here to supply chain risk management. So again, this is a really important area. It's not easy. There are aspects of supply chain that are and vendor management that are already in place probably at many of your customers. In terms of governance, how you govern new relationships with new customers. This is typically owned between legal and procurement, but security should have a place at the table for sure. And if you go to the next slide, there's some of the there's a kind of graphic I took here from I think it's from NIST, and there's a link at the bottom of the page. But basically, it's kind of showing how you can manage that at organization. And if we go to the next page, tiering is really important, because you obviously can't ensure that every vendor goes through the same level of checks, and some of your customers might already do this to a certain level, but putting in place security requirements based upon the nature of the services provided. So are they in your environment? Are they providing software to you? Do they have access to your customer data? Obviously, those ones are much more important, and you should be doing an actual assessment of their part of their environment or part of their practices. You should do that more often. You should have monitoring around those systems, et cetera, versus a service provider that's only providing, let's say some tools that don't touch your critical data, right? This is different, and maybe shouldn't go through the same level of impact there. But asking your customers how they manage their vendors and how they manage their suppliers, and making sure you extend this to software, very critical. I think we have a slide here actually touching a little bit on software as well. So this was not typically much of a focus in most vendor management and supply chain management discussions until kind of a year and a half ago, when there was a widespread attack that basically many of you might have heard of it, but SolarWinds, a network management tool used by thousands of organizations worldwide to monitor infrastructure for organizations. Their software was actually impacted by an attacker, where they placed a backdoor into a software update that not everyone, but many people updated to the software, and they were all vulnerable. And essentially, this was mostly targeting government entities, but also other entities that many entities not a government were also impacted. And the attacker had remote access to the environment and could essentially get into those organizations. So importance around software is that you buy a solution, it might not be even security related, but you should understand, what their software development practices are, how you test updates from that vendor so that you can identify potentially a bad update. It's difficult, it's very hard to do, but at least have some governance practice in there to make sure it's properly hardened and you understand the potential threats. And for example, if that system is in your environment, where is it? And is there monitoring in place to detect anything that could be unusual around that system? So something to keep in mind as well. Another approach that, okay, there's a question here around FOSS, better the proprietary software from public audit aspect. So there are different approaches for kind of how you can look at software. So, there are benefits of open source. There's benefits of, there are, I can definitely provide some comments here afterwards as well. But essentially, code that has seen more scrutiny from a publicly audited perspective, may have potentially less risk, right? If more pairs of eyes have seen it. So, but I can provide some more information there too. One thing that we've kind of been doing for our customers, and this has been a kind of a growing approach more broadly in cybersecurity, is taking kind of a crown jewels or critical asset view of the program. And the reason for this is that you really cannot protect every asset in your environment equally. It just can't be done. And many organizations, especially larger ones, have actually, if you include some of their spreadsheets they use and other systems they use, a bank very, very likely has over 1,000 different systems that they leverage day to day, right? Some are used by wealth management, some are used by accounting, some are used by finance, some are used by HR. There's dozens and dozens and dozens of systems. Some might be cloud-based, some are SaaS provided, some are on-prem, some are legacy, some are home developed. How do you protect all those systems, right? So you have to understand, first of all, what are the most important systems in your organization? And maybe out of the 1,000 systems, maybe only 25 would be crown jewels that either have all your customer data or a lot of your customer data, or they're critical from an operation of your business. And for those systems, first of all, identify what those are, have a program in place to increase monitoring around those systems, have response plans in place to recover those systems, and then be able to also take a countermeasure view of, are those properly protected? Again, not every system can have all the protection that you would want to have, but at least making sure those crown jewels have that becomes really critical. So this is something to kind of maybe apply for your customers or encourage them to do to help kind of further focus on the areas that matter the most. Next slide. Perfect. And I touched on some of these already too, but again, making sure that you have proper segmentation in the environment from an IT perspective, you architect your access management properly, you have the security controls, especially around email, around your endpoints, your network, your firewalls, right? Your plans and your governance around those, your preparedness from ransomware, and your backups, super critical, especially for those crown jewels. Next slide. A few other things here from a kind of practice perspective, just broadly security, so not necessarily for ransomware or whatever, but ensuring that you actually test your security, either through third-party reviews, red teaming, penetration testing, multi-factor or dual-factor authentication for your remote access, super critical, especially with a remote workforce. This is almost, most breaches we see, the organization did not have multi-factor enabled for the remote access, and an attacker compromised credentials and was able to gain access to the environment because there was not a second factor. So either through like the keys that generate on your phone, or a dedicated key fob or a security key, super critical. Right now, for example, as Craig mentioned, we've actually been acquired by Google. Google requires all employees, every time you log into your computer, you have to have a security key and you have to touch the security key to get in your computer every single time. So again, that's on the extreme side, but that reduces the risk because an attacker actually has to have your key to get in, right? Making sure you develop your incident response plans, making sure you actually are proactively hunting the environment. An MSSP can actually help with this, right? They can do ongoing threat hunting in your environment, or if you're larger, you can actually do this yourself. And managing your access, of course, really important. and leveraging threat intelligence. Another thing here that, again, a large organization would have a program in place to understand what's happening in the threat environment, so you can actually then hunt, for example, for those indicators of compromise to better detect. And I just wanted to, just conscious of the time, I know we're here at the end almost, and we have gone through a lot of the questions, but some quick takeaways, and then I'll open it up. But essentially, kind of a few things here I want to leave you with. Making sure you know your critical assets, or your customers know your critical assets, super important. You can leverage, defined frameworks for helping with this and helping for security in general. So there's NIST CSF, for example, is a very popular framework that's leveraged in North America, especially. ISO 27001, there's some specific frameworks around cyber risk management, and also ransomware, and also supply chain. So there's a lot of frameworks out there that are freely available that can help your clients structure their approach for managing their programs and managing some of these aspects we talked about. It's also always important to test your processes, make sure you have a defense in depth approach. So not just one control set, there is no silver bullet in security. One security control will not protect you across the board. So making sure you have multiple potential controls that you can protect, and you have kind of a multiple lines of defense approach. And, things will happen. You will get compromised. It's not a matter of if, it's when. So making sure that you have a plan for if you do get breached, you can respond effectively. You test that plan, and you actually do have people on retainer, right? So there are, like we talked about, there are ransomware advisory firms that you can have on retainer for free that can provide you with the negotiation services. You have that done in advance. There's incident response firms that can help you with investigations and recovery. And there's crisis management communication firms, and of course, external counsel to help with privacy and kind of breach reporting requirements, as well as keeping things under privilege. So I know we covered a lot of material. The slides will be shared, or they already actually shared here, but we'll open it up to questions now. And hopefully you found this interesting and informative.
Thank you very much, Marcus. This is such an important topic today, especially as you pointed out at the beginning, with so many businesses being moved into, the remote world, and obviously the improvements and efficiencies of saving money and going out to the cloud, but the risks there. I think everybody knows we have to go through this, and it's a bit of a learning curve. As management consultants, we get asked a lot of questions about a lot of different elements of business. From a cybersecurity perspective, where do you think a management consultant ought to sort of start that conversation with their clients?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think you have a privileged role in terms of you are dealing with very very strategic projects for your customers, right? It could be transformation work. It could be, major kind of change management projects. It could be, many very, very sensitive things that are very strategic to the organization. Making sure that security is a consideration in those projects. Again, you might not be handling all that aspect, but making sure the customer is thinking about that. Helping them also to really think about security from a risk perspective and understand what the risk is and understand what the impact is for their business and their operations and their revenue, right? This is very important. Being able to, many organizations really struggle from a budgeting perspective, and from being able to actually help, the C-level understand that they're spending enough or spending too much or not spending enough, right? How do you justify your security spend? And I think you also have the skill set to help with that as well from a kind of financial perspective. But I think just making sure it's top of mind and you're ready to kind of to answer those questions that might be coming to you.
And you've talked about having a framework for cybersecurity as being critical, probably one of the first steps to moving forward, whether it's from the board down, management down, and from the IT people up. And they got to come together and have a good plan and a good framework. You talked about NIST, the National Institute of Standards and Technology for the U.S. Department of Commerce. They have a cybersecurity framework, CSF. That's there available on the internet to help businesses of all sizes to manage and reduce their cybersecurity risks and protect their networks and data. They actually have, I think you might have pointed out, 5 elements: identify, protect, detect, respond, and recover.
Yes.
And then there's also the ISO 27001.
Yep.
Yeah. Thanks. Framework. Which ones should we be adopting or promoting?
Great question. I would say that the dominant framework that's been leveraged in North America is definitely NIST CSF. And this is because it is really right sized for many organizations, that it's more flexible, it's easier to structure, and it's a little bit less paper and policy heavy. ISO is a great framework as well. It tends to be a lot more intensive from an implementation perspective. If a business is getting kind of asked to show that they're ISO certified, or parts of their business are ISO certified, that is then something that is beneficial. There's no NIST certification, but there are ISO certifications, right? So I would say ISO is a little bit more of an audit framework. I would say a little bit more compliance driven. Honestly, about 85% of my customers are leveraging NIST CSF. Where I see ISO more often is in Europe. Europe ISO 27001 has been more popular there, and in some other regions too. But NIST has become kind of the de facto standard, I would say.
Right, and it's a great website to go check out and to get this topic started on if you haven't. If you don't have some of those tools at your disposal. Thank you, Marcus Troiano, today for this discussion, a really important one. Thanks to also Sandra Addison Brock from CMC Ontario, our events coordinator and producer of the show. Next month, join us December 14th, Exploring Canada's Entrepreneurship Ecosystem with Kayla Isabel from Startup Canada. Register now for the Converge networking event for next week. My big takeaway from today's session is the new war is the cyber war and the cyber warfare. You need to be equipped for that. So get a cybersecurity framework in place for your company and your clients. Put double or multiple authentication in place for your personal, corporate banking, for your logons, and for all your cloud properties. Wear your poppy with pride and have a great Movember, everyone.